I'm going to talk about what I've decided to call responsible psychometric optimization. I think basically this means personalization with two twists. So the first twist is the psychometric bit. What that is trying to get at is that we, as psychometricians, we care not about doing a kind of behavioral prediction where you say, recommend X to someone because they clicked Y, but rather looking at the fact they clicked Y and trying to explain it using some kind of psychological theory or matching it to some psychological data. So we care about what latent traits, what psychological variables are driving the behavior, rather than necessarily predicting from behavior to behavior. And the second twist is the responsible side. So when working with social media data and psychological data, obviously the way in which that data is collected and handled and subsequently used is very, very important. So I'm going to try and present some of kind of the principles, if you like, that we've developed over our journey using these techniques in a marketing or commerce context, and hopefully get some feedback from you later as well about whether you think these principles are practicable or not. So this journey started for us really 10 years ago when my colleague made My Personality. So this was a Facebook app that allowed you to take lots of different psychometric tests. So psychometric tests, as distinguished from other kinds of questionnaires or surveys, are designed in a specific way so that you don't take the answer to a question at face value. It's that every question gives you a little bit more information about some stable psychological trait. So something like intelligence or personality or morality or values, these kinds of things. So there were about 30 different tests online there. Over 6 million people opted in to share their test scores and their Facebook data with us. So that resulted in this huge, very rich, very diverse database of psychological information and also digitized behavior. So what's really exciting about the Facebook side of the data is that you can look back into someone's Facebook behavior going back to when they started their account. So now as a psychologist, instead of asking people, what did you do last week? Can you remember? Describe to me the structure of your social network. You can actually start to answer some questions that you wouldn't normally be able to answer in a statistically valid manner. And that's been very powerful. And one of the main things that came out of this was a paper published in March 2013 showing that using those digital records of your behavior, you can very accurately predict the psychological traits. So we're no longer asking questions as psychometricians, we're just looking at previous historical behavior going back potentially 10 years or longer, and analyzing that and comparing it to the psychological data using machine learning and other statistical techniques. So this paper made quite a splash and was kind of quite widely reported, and that was also around the time when I joined the Psychometric Center. So it was a time when lots of businesses were calling us up saying, this sounds exciting, how do we use it? And the university had no way of really putting that into practice or getting data from businesses to do new kinds of research. So that's what I do. So some of the things that are predictable about all of us from our digital footprints are these traits. So these are just some of them. We haven't really found the limit yet. So personality, intelligence, life satisfaction, whether your parents were together when you were 21, whether you've used addictive substances, lots of other private stuff like sexuality, political and religious views and so on. These are all, it's not that someone goes online and writes a status update saying, I'm a terrible financial risk. Maybe people do that, but that's not what's happening here. It's not being taken at face value. It's that people with varying personality scores or varying risk propensities behave in slightly different ways. And normally you can't necessarily observe those as a human being unless you're a very, very maybe skilled insurance salesman or something. But this is basically looking at all of the behavior of an individual and trying to analyze and make sense of it. So these are some things that are predictable and also traits which could potentially be used to personalize content. So it's not enough to personalize, you have to also deliver the personalized content to the relevant group. So it's no use having a perfect piece of content that is really, really perfect for liberal and artistic people who are high in openness if you end up showing it to lots of conservative and traditional people. And people often forget that you actually need both sides. You need the assessment, but also the targeting. So these are some examples of pages or preferences that are highly correlated with high openness. So if you were to show the ad to people who like these pages, and you can generate lists as long as you like, then you're more likely to reach a target audience of the psychological profile that you'd like to speak to. And this works with lots of different traits. So, it's in some cases it's obvious that more intelligent people are more likely to like Mozart and science, but maybe it's not as obvious that they also like walking on crunchy leaves, or Morgan Freeman's voice, or curly fries, or any number of other kind of spurious correlations that come out. These are people that are not very friendly, so it's kind of very competitive. Yeah, so they're well-dressed, competitive business people, but not so friendly, not as interested in teamwork. And you can, of course, combine these traits. So you could ask the database what preferences are exhibited by someone who is well-organized, of above-average IQ, very competitive, of such and such moral foundation, and so on. So you can combine these traits in quite interesting ways. As I said, that paper was published in March 2013, and quite soon after that we kind of realized, okay, maybe there's some potential to try this out and do some research in a marketing context. So one of our developers happened to have made a crossword app, so we thought, okay, let's try and sell this very boring crossword app using these techniques. So we designed an ad on the left, and this is people who have never done any kind of content-related or marketing work whatsoever before. So it was a little bit kind of starting from scratch and trying to test this out. But we said, okay, introverted people probably don't want to have lots of other people in the images, whereas extroverts would rather have the idea that somehow playing this crossword app is an extroverted thing to do. And I'm sure plenty of extroverts do also like crosswords. But it's quite difficult. So this was quite an introverted product in itself. We got a bit of an uplift when targeting this through Facebook ads, but we knew probably we could do better if we worked with someone who actually knew what they were doing. So in July, I was invited to the Commerce Futures event and presented some kind of early ideas, and probably that crossword study, and said, we can also try and do this with language. And this was basically really the start of the journey. So it's been interesting for me coming to these events over the years as well to see how my own understanding of what's being said has also grown.
A bigger head as well.
Yeah. So we partnered with Hilton Hotels through an agency to try and test this out with real product in an applied context. And we did a very similar thing. So it was designed as a split study where we were showing all of the ads to all target groups, but then comparing the matching conditions to the controls. So a matching condition is one where the ad is the way that the ad is personalized matches the profile of the person. So for example, showing extroverted ads on the left to extroverted people using those target keyword lists. And this was a bit more successful, so it has a kind of brand layer or content layer on it as well. So instead of saying you're very high in conscientiousness, we say, okay, maybe these people make an itinerary before they travel. And conscientiousness is also related to more wellness behaviors. They're more likely to be members of a gym, they spend more money on health and fitness and so on. So we were trying to bring that into the design of the creative. And that had very good results. So click-through was 1,750% increased. ROI of 7-to-1 was good versus what they had been doing in the past. Here's some more examples with agreeableness. So team-working, family-oriented people, you can communicate with them in a different way. So this is still quite early. We knew we needed to test it, and basically they didn't record the statistics properly from the campaign. So this is kind of a lesson for everyone as well, that they kind of arbitrarily attributed 10% of view-through revenue to the campaign, but there was no explanation as to why it was 10% as opposed to some other percentage. So we didn't really know how much of the revenue was coming from our study and how much was coming from other channels. So we had to kind of do it again to test the revenue side. So again, we designed this split study. This is with a cosmetics brand. So introverted ad says beauty doesn't have to shout. Extroverted one has a more extroverted, higher contrast image and says dance like no one's watching. Not so difficult to personalize the content, I think, even if you know nothing about selling makeup. So you showed both ads to both groups, and we found that when the content was psychometrically optimized, it's twice as profitable. So when the ad matches the person, they're much more likely not just to click through, but actually to go on and buy the product. And we've done some related research to this, saying that when people actually spend their money in a way that corresponds with their personality, their happiness also increases. So that's kind of a nice message. If you get this right, then you're making people happier as well as getting them to buy a product. What hadn't been tested so much was more the awareness side. So here we were working with Hilton trying to look at more at social engagement metrics and raise brand awareness rather than, these apps still linked through to sales pages, but it was a different way of speaking to the customer. So again, instead of saying you're conscientious or you're open or you're impulsive, which are kind of psychological words, we said you're a deliberator, traveler type, you're a wanderer, traveler type, and so on. So these were kind of branded versions of things that are underpinned by psychological theory. And those did pretty well too. So I presented again, kind of, this is the journey, this is what we've learned so far. And then basically everything changed after that because a company called, let's call them Oxford Analytica, but they're called Cambridge Analytica, came on the scene. They were set up in June 2014. And after the Trump election, they started basically taking credit for getting Trump elected, saying that they had managed to use psychographics to target and influence the vote around the US, using techniques that sounded very similar to what we had published a year and a half before they were founded. And actually there was a meeting between their parent company and some of my colleagues that obviously went very stale very quickly. So we're suddenly now in the situation where, when I first presented, July 2014, no one really knew that psychometrics could be applied to this content, and now everyone's heard about Cambridge Analytica and psychographic targeting and all this kind of thing, so we're in a completely different world. And this is what The Guardian says about them. They could, for example, target people high in neuroticism with images of immigrants swamping the country to encourage their natural inclination for fear. So neuroticism and natural inclination for fear are psychological constructs that are predictable from your digital behavior, as I just showed you. And you can target those people using all kinds of methods, including Facebook, Twitter, and all the rest. So now suddenly we're in this completely different world where others are doing this for political reasons, commercial reasons, and we're trying to rein in the underlying principles of this research and this technology. So those principles that have emerged from our research in this area and that I'd like to share with you. The first one is control. So, of course, informed consent is an important part of this, and all of the data we use was collected with opt-in consent. But I think it's actually about control. So people don't like having predictions made about them without their knowledge and without their consent. So it's not just the point at which you collect the data, but it's also how you subsequently will use it that you need to communicate very clearly. Secondly, be transparent with the customers. So if you do make a prediction or a recommendation, explain what data is being used to make it, and that gives them an opportunity to even correct or interact with you, and maybe that will mean your recommendation is better the second time. Provide a benefit as a result of that, so try to do something useful or valuable to the customer rather than just doing it because you want to be seen to be using data-driven methods, even if they don't actually change the experience. And finally, make it relevant. So one of the problems with a lot of this work, or the application of this work, is that people don't realize why they need to share their Facebook profile in order to get a personalized recommendation. So the steps aren't kind of explained. It's not explained that you're predicting psychology and then changing the content and then delivering new content. And that's a big problem. So I think face validity is something that we could try to improve. So that's where we've gotten to, and this is kind of a very recent project from about 2 months ago. Unfortunately, I can't say who it was with yet, but maybe it will be public soon.
Yes.
Yes, but I'll have to do poker face to try. It's a very, very large global sports brand. And the sport that they were particularly focusing on has a very kind of quite a narrow demographic of customers, so predominantly male and predominantly kind of quite young, between the age of 18 and 23. And this was the case across all of their brands in other countries as well. So the first thing we wanted, and what we were aiming to do with the client was improve their personalization. So they were very good at doing demographic and interest-based and behavioral targeting, but they didn't really know how to talk to different personalities within that demographic group, which is obviously quite specific, but also very broad in terms of numbers of people around the world. So the first thing we did was we found that we already had personality data on a couple thousand of their customers. So these are people that had taken our tests but happened to also like the brand on Facebook, so we had some information about them already, and we found that they were mostly characterized on average by being high in extroversion and low in neuroticism. And this was kind of consistent with other brands and other competitors in the sport on whom we also had data, but we thought this is probably a good place to start in terms of trying to have personality-informed content. What we also did, which we hadn't done before in previous studies, was do personality clustering. So because we had a couple thousand people for whom we had data, we could break that average personality into more and more clusters. And this is a statistical technique that throws away a lot of data, but basically tries to find the number of groups of people that best explains the variance in behavior. So you end up, for example, with two clusters of two very different types of customer in terms of personality, even though the demographic and interest information is the same. But obviously the way you'd speak to the one on the left, which is basically very extroverted, very artistic, very stable, is quite different to how you'd speak to the person who's kind of more emotional, less well organized, more competitive, and so on. So we broke down the data to try and find clusters that would best explain different personality types within the audience that they already knew about. And we could also tailor language to those clusters. So, as I said, you communicate in different ways with these people, and I showed you some examples of that with the cosmetics brand. But this is kind of a data-driven approach. The other thing you need to do is that because behavior on social media platforms is so diverse, and there are tens of millions of different things you could possibly like, when working with a client, we found that we actually needed to make this much more interpretable. So it wasn't good enough to provide a keyword list containing 100 keywords that they should target. We had to try and group them in some way that made sense to the creative team, so they could actually get a sense of who these people are. The way you do that is by something called LDA, topic modeling. This is similar to the clustering approach I showed you with personality, but basically you kind of see the process here. So you go from a set of all of the likes by all of the users, so 35 million different user-like pairs where we have a user and some connection to a brand, and you emerge with some kind of ideas, and then you match those topics to the personality clusters. And then you can start, rather than saying cluster number 1, which is of this personality, likes these 500 things, you can say cluster number 1 is more interested in politics, in sports magazines, in these kind of more clusters or concepts. So we'll have to see how well that does, but it was a real learning experience for us to do this clustering, use these new techniques, and try to combine language with image, with behavioral data, which is something we hadn't done before. So my kind of closing note is that I hope that using some of those principles, we can come to develop a kind of industry best practice around responsible personalization. And I think that will hopefully result in better outcomes both for customers, and that they can trust the people that are marketing and communicating with them, and also better for in-house creative teams as well, where they get information on the people they're designing for in a way that they haven't had before. That's all. Thanks very much.